Breathe out slowly, let the edges of the room soften. You do not need to hold on to the shape of this day any longer. You can set it down, here, in the dark, and let it rest beside you while something older rises up to take its place. We are going back tonight. Not merely decades, not centuries in the way that history books count centuries, but so far back that the very stars above Westeros would have looked different in their slow turning. So far back that the wall did not yet exist, and the iron of every Valyrian sword still lay sleeping inside the earth, waiting for a fire that would not come for another 10,000 years. There is no urgency in where we are going. The past is patient. It has already waited this long. Let your breathing slow. The journey begins, as most profound journeys do, not with a sound, but with a silence, the particular silence of a world that has not yet been broken. And to understand what the Night King was, and what he may truly have meant, we must first understand what Westeros was before anyone thought to send a man into the frozen dark. The continent that would one day be called Westeros was not always a land of fractured kingdoms and burning ambitions. In the age before recorded history, before the first men crossed the arm of dawn from the eastern continent, before the Andals brought their 7 gods and their steel across the narrow sea, Westeros was a place of immeasurable green silence. The children of the forest had named it their own for tens of thousands of years, those small beings with their bark-brown skin and their eyes of gold and green, their voices that carried the faint quality of wind moving through the needles of a pine. They did not build cities. They had no use for the particular ambition that cities represent. The desire to anchor oneself, to declare, here is my permanence, here is my mark upon the stone of the world. The children lived lightly upon the land, and the land gave back to them in kind. There is something worth holding gently in your mind as you settle deeper towards sleep, a world that chose smallness over dominance. The children of the forest were not primitive. They were ancient and wise in ways that the conquerors who came later never fully understood. They carved faces into the pale bark of weirwood trees, those white-trunked, red-leaved witnesses that stood in groves from the haunted forest all the way to the most southerly reaches of what would one day be the Reach. Those faces were not decoration. They were not art in the way that later peoples understood art. They were apertures, openings through which the greenseers could look and listen and remember. The specific quality of the silence inside a weirwood grove is something that several of the oldest wildling traditions attempt to describe, and all of them use the same language of absence. Not the absence of sound, precisely, but the absence of a particular kind of mental noise. People who spent time in the groves reported that their ordinary anxieties became quieter. Not resolved, not addressed, but quieter, as though the wood had absorbed some fraction of the urgency that human minds generate continuously, and replaced it with something that was not quite peace, but was perhaps the precondition of peace. The recognition that the world was very old and had seen most things before, and was still here, and that the most important qualities were patience, and the willingness to keep watching. The Weirwoods were the internet of an older world. Every face-carved tree connected to every other through a vast, slow root network that moved beneath the soil of an entire continent. Greenseers, those children born with the rare gift of the sight, could enter this network and perceive events happening miles and centuries away, simultaneously. They could see backward and forward in the same way that you might look at both ends of a long hall. Time, for them, was not a line but a pool. They sat beside it and watched its whole surface at once, and what they saw there gave them wisdom of a kind that is difficult to even name in the language of kingdoms and wars. Into this world the first men came, 12,000 years before the events of the main series, if the Masters of the Citadel are to be believed, and 12,000 years is a span of time that is almost meaningless to the ordinary mind. Consider what 12,000 years looks like on the scale of the human experience. It is the distance from the rise of the very first agricultural settlements in the ancient world to this precise quiet moment in which you're lying still, breathing slowly, letting the weight of your limbs press downward into the fabric of the bed beneath you. That is what 12,000 years feels like. It is everything. The first men crossed the arm of dawn in enormous numbers, a migration so large and so sustained that it would have felt to the children watching from their weirwood groves like a tide. These were not gentle arrivals. They came with bronze axes and they cut the weirwoods. This, to the children, was not merely destruction of trees. It was a severing of the network. It was violence against memory itself, And so there was war, a long and grinding conflict across the whole of the continent, fought between beings who had lived there for eons and beings who had simply arrived with more bodies and more blades. The war ended eventually with a pact. On an island in the middle of a lake, the children of the forest and the first men met and drew a truce that would define the shape of Westeros for centuries to come. The first men would keep the open land, the plains, the coastlines, the cleared earth, and the children would hold the forests. The weirwood trees would not be cut, and the first men remarkably agreed to this second condition, and to seal the pact they carved their own faces into weirwood trees, and knelt before them and offered their remembrance to the old gods, those gods who were the Weirwood network itself, the accumulated consciousness of 10,000 years of green seer memory looking out through carved stone eyes. It is worth pausing here, before the story accelerates toward its inevitable darkness. Sit with this moment for a breath or two. A conquered people and a conquering people found a way to share a world. The first men gave up their axes and accepted the memory of the forest as something sacred. This was not a small thing. In the long history of peoples meeting peoples, the willingness to kneel before the other's gods and say, yes, these are real, these matter. This is vanishingly rare. And for 4,000 years the pact held. 4,000 years of relative quiet, during which the first men and the children lived in a kind of careful, respectful coexistence that the later inhabitants of Westeros could barely imagine, let alone replicate. The modern echoes of this age live everywhere in the world that Jon Snow and Bran Stark and Daenerys Targaryen inhabit, though none of them fully understands the inheritance they carry. When Ned Stark knelt before the heart tree in Winterfell's Godswood, and closed his eyes and pressed his hands flat to the cool earth, he was performing a ritual that his ancestors had agreed to 12,000 years before his birth. The old gods he prayed to, formless, wordless, represented only by the red-leaved tree and its carved face, those gods were real. They were real in the way that a vast root-deep consciousness distributed across a continent is real. They were the children's gift to the first men, and the first men's gift to all who came after. Bran Stark, who would one day become the most profound greenseer the world had seen in living memory, would enter this network without fully understanding that he was stepping into the accumulated experience of 12,000 years of grief and wonder and patient, arboreal watchfulness. The world before the Night King was a world that had, however imperfectly, found a way to hold its contradictions gently. It was a world with a memory distributed across every pale-barked tree on the continent, a memory so long and so deep that it contained within itself the shape of every winter that had ever come, and the knowledge, not the hope, the knowledge, of every spring that had followed after. That knowledge would matter, that memory would matter, in ways that no one who came later ever entirely grasped. The choices made during those 4,000 years of the pact would determine everything, even the long night, even what rose in the darkness to end it. Let that thought rest like snow on water, slow and quiet and settling. The world before the catastrophe was green and vast and full of a kind of listening that we have almost entirely lost the language to describe. Somewhere beneath the permafrost of the far north something was waiting. But it had not yet been called into being, it had not yet been made, and in the peace before the making, the trees were still pale and the leaves were still red, and the voices of the forest still moved through the cold air of 10,000 groves, singing in a register just too low for ordinary human ears to hear, carrying forward the memory of a world that was about to change forever. The Weirwood network was not simply a library, though the library metaphor is the most useful one for the modern mind attempting to grasp it. A library preserves text. Text is a representation of experience, a translation of something lived into something encoded. The Weirwood network preserved the experience itself, without the loss that translation always involves. When a greenseer looked through the network, they did not read about a moment. They were in it. They felt the temperature of the air. They heard the specific quality of the silence just before a significant decision was made. They perceived the full texture of the past, not its summary. This is why greensight was both a gift and, over time, an enormous burden. To see everything is also to carry everything, and everything is very heavy. The first men who eventually knelt before the Weirwoods and accepted the old gods were not making an abstract theological commitment. They were agreeing to be seen. to be recorded, to add their own faces and their own moments to the ongoing archive that the network maintained. There is something in this that is almost like a second pact, quieter than the formal one negotiated on the Isle of Faces, but perhaps more significant, the Pact of Visibility. I will not hide from the memory of this land. I will allow the trees to know me. I will let my grief and my joy and my small daily decisions be part of the record of the world. This was the original meaning of the prayer at the heart tree, the bending of the knee before the carved face, the pressed palms against the bark. When Ned Stark performed this ritual, as he did every morning in the Godswood of Winterfell, in the grey northern light with the sound of the waterfall behind him, and the smell of cold earth and leaf mould around him, he was participating in something 11,000 years older than the castle that surrounded him. The castle was new, on the timescale that mattered. The prayer was ancient. The face in the pale bark had been watching that particular curve of rock and water and growing thing for longer than any Stark lineage could claim, longer than the name Stark existed, longer than the language in which that name was spoken had been spoken anywhere on the continent. And the network connected through it to every other face on every other tree across the whole of Westeros, and through those connections to everything that had ever been seen. And when Ned pressed his hands against the bark and bowed his head, the whole accumulated weight of that seeing pressed gently back. Your breath is slow, your body is heavy, the forest is watching, and it is kind. Rest now, and let the world before drift quietly past, and trust that the night holds nothing here but history, and history is a story that has already ended, and you are safe within its ending. Segment 2, The Weapon That Remembered. How the Night King was made and why you are deeper now. The ordinary noise of the day, the specific anxieties, the unfinished sentences, the small regrets. Those have moved further away, and in their place there is only this, a voice and a story, and the slow tide of your own breath moving in and out in the darkness. Allow the room to be exactly as large as it is, or as small. Allow the weight of the covers to be exactly as heavy as they are. There is nothing to adjust. You have arrived at the only place you need to be tonight, which is still and breathing and listening. We are going back now to the moment of making, to the specific deliberate act that set the next 8,000 years of Westeros in motion. The children of the forest did not summon the Long Night accidentally. They did not stumble into the creation of the White Walkers as a consequence of carelessness or ignorance. They built something on purpose, with intention and design, out of the materials they had available, and the most available material, the most abundant and most terrible resource in any age of war, was their own desperation. The pact had held. 4,000 years of relative quiet, of the first men and the children sharing a continent under the witness of the Weirwood network. But then something shifted. The maesters of the Citadel do not record what it was. The records of this age are fragmentary at best, mythological at worst, passed down through traditions that the Andals later disrupted and nearly destroyed. But something in the long equilibrium cracked. The first men began cutting the Weirwoods again, or some faction of them did. The forest began to shrink, and the children, who had lived in those forests since before memory, who had built their entire civilization around the premise that the trees would persist, faced a prospect that was not merely territorial loss, but existential unravelling. It is worth breathing slowly through this particular understanding, because it changes everything that follows. The children of the forest were not the gentle passive creatures that a surface reading of their mythology might suggest. They were ancient, yes, and they were wise, yes, but they were also beings who had watched their world erode over millennia, who had made concessions and more concessions, who had retreated from the open land and then from the edges of the forest, and then from grove after grove until what remained was a fraction of what had been. They were, in the language of any era, a people watching themselves disappear, and so they reached for the most terrible option. In a cave somewhere in the far north of the continent, the show suggests what the books leave ambiguous, and we will draw from both in the way that sleep and law both permit. The children of the forest captured a man, a first man, full-grown, adult, capable of choice, and therefore capable of having something taken from him that mattered. They brought him to a great weirwood that stood alone on a hill, and they pressed his back against it, and they bound him there, and a child of the forest with fused fingers and two wide eyes pressed a shard of dragonglass, obsidian, the frozen fire of the earth's own interior, directly into his living heart. There is a coldness in this act that has nothing to do with temperature, Sit with it for a moment. These were beings who had, for tens of thousands of years, been defined by their relationship to the trees, which is to say by their relationship to memory and continuity, and the long patience of growing things. And they chose to take that ancient knowledge and weaponize it. They chose to create something that had never existed before in the entire history of Westeros, an undying soldier, a being of ice and memory and implacable purpose, designed to function as a weapon against the species that was consuming the forest. They pressed dragonglass into a man's heart, and they made winter itself into a consciousness. The man who became the Night King, and this is the detail that the television series renders with the kind of bleak economy that great tragedy sometimes achieves, screamed and then went still, and then opened eyes that were no longer the eyes he had been born with. They were blue, not the blue of sky or water, but the blue of deep ice, the blue of something that has been cold for so long that cold has become its nature rather than its condition. He had been a man who could choose. He became a force that could only pursue the singular purpose for which he had been remade. The children of the forest believed they had created a weapon. They believed they retained some control over what they had made. This is one of the oldest mistakes in the entire history of intelligent beings making powerful things, the assumption that the Creator governs the creation. The Night King did not remain their weapon. He became his own purpose, and his purpose, once the coldness had settled fully into him, and the Weirwood's memory had flooded through the obsidian and into his altered blood, was not merely to fight the first men. His purpose became something older and stranger and more absolute than that, to end the noise of the living world entirely and return Westeros to the silence that the children of the forest had, in their desperate grief, mistaken for peace. The modern echo of this moment runs deepest in the character of Bran Stark, who would sit in that same Weirwood network thousands of years later and see the moment of the Night King's creation with his own inherited eyes. What Bran witnessed in that vision was not ancient history. It was a loop. The children of the forest, trying to save themselves, had created the existential threat that would ultimately require the entire human world of Westeros to unite against it. The survival strategy had become the extinction event, and the Night King, who had begun as a man, whose name the books have never given us, whose life before the obsidian we know nothing of, who had perhaps a family and a fire and a preference for one kind of meat over another, that man was still, somewhere inside the ice, still there, still present, still screaming perhaps in a register too deep and too cold for any living ear to catch. There is a particular weight to the understanding that the most terrible things in history are made by the most frightened people, not by the cruel, necessarily, not by the power-hungry, but by those who have been backed to the edge of something unendurable and have reached in their extremity for a solution that seems proportionate to their terror. The children of the forest were terrified. The Night King was their terror given form and given will, and given, eventually, an independence of purpose that his makers had never intended and could not reverse. He walked away from the Weirwood, and the long night followed after him like a coat, and the world of Westeros changed in a single step from something that was ancient and layered and breathing to something that was cold and still and very, very quiet. Jon Snow would spend his entire adult life, in one sense, paying the price for this moment. Every ranging beyond the wall, every diplomatic gamble, every willingness to die and to keep dying in service of a coalition that barely believed in its own necessity. All of it was downstream of this one act in a cave or on a hillside, this one shard of dragonglass pressed against a heartbeat that would never beat quite the same way again. Jon didn't know this. He operated on instinct and on a moral code that had been hammered into him by Ned Stark's patient example. But the thing he was fighting was not simply a monster. It was a monument to the unintended consequences of fear. It was a weapon that had outlived its makers and their war and their civilization and their very names, still moving, still purposeful, still carrying inside its blue-eyed silence the memory of the moment it had been unmade. The name of the man who became the Night King is one of the most persistently melancholy absences in the lore of Westeros. Not because names are cosmologically significant, though in this world they sometimes are, but because the absence of the name is itself a kind of statement about what the transformation took. When the dragonglass was pressed into him, and the change came over him, whatever the children of the forest knew him as, whatever syllables his own people had used to call him to a fire or to a meal or to a council, those syllables became irrelevant. They were the property of a person who no longer existed. The Night King had no use for the name. Names belong to beings who participate in the social world of the living, who need to be distinguished from one another, who have relationships that require designation. The Night King was alone in a way that made names redundant. He was the only one of himself. He did not need a name any more than winter needs a name. There is a tradition in some of the oldest Wildling clan stories, preserved in fragments that the maesters catalogued without understanding their significance, that the man who became the Night King was a warrior of exceptional ability among his people, that he had been chosen, as the children later chose him, not because he was cruel or ambitious, but because he was capable, strong, skilled, experienced in the cold. The very qualities that made him an effective fighter were the qualities the children needed in their weapon. They were not looking for someone who would enjoy what was done to him. They were looking for someone who could survive it, and then function within it, and then move. The man who became the Night King survived. He functioned. He moved. And everything that had made him worth choosing in the first place, the strength, the endurance, the capacity to persist in impossible conditions, was still there inside the ice, still operating, still purposeful, but now in service of a will that was no longer entirely his own. The children of the forest who performed the transformation are not recorded in any tradition by name either. Their faces are not preserved even in the Weirwood network, or if they are preserved there, they are not faces that any surviving Greenseer has thought to look for. They did their work and they lived with what they had done, and when the Night King moved away from the tree he had been bound to and walked north into the cold that was already beginning to build, they would have watched him go with whatever the equivalent of horror and grief looks like in a species whose emotional register was formed over tens of thousands of years of quiet forest existence. They had made a weapon. They had released it into the world, and they would spend the remaining centuries of their civilization understanding, very slowly, that the weapon had its own ideas about the world it was moving through. What the children could not have anticipated, what perhaps no being of sufficient wisdom existed to anticipate, was that the Weirwood network's own memory would become the Night King's inheritance. They had pressed him against a Weirwood not merely to bind him, but because the Weirwood was the medium through which the magic flowed. The obsidian was the conductor, the tree was the source, and in the moment of his making, the full depth of what the tree contained, 10,000 years of watching, recording, holding, had flooded into him and become irrevocably his own interior landscape. He had not simply been weaponized. He had been educated comprehensively and instantly in everything the oldest beings on the continent had ever seen or known. The children had made a soldier and produced a scholar, cold and vast and impossible to control, carrying inside his transformed chest the complete archive of the world they had been trying to protect. Let your breath settle. The making is done. The Night King is out in the world now, cold and purposeful and unlike anything that has walked the continent before. What he does with the years that follow, what the long night actually was, what it felt like from inside its darkness, what it cost, that is a story for the next quiet movement of this night. For now, simply notice your own breath, warm and steady, moving in and out, and allow yourself to be grateful for the uncomplicated miracle of it. That you are warm, that you're here, that the ice is far away, that you're already, slowly, beginning to drift toward the deep country of sleep. There is a specific quality to the darkness just before sleep takes you completely. A loosening of the edges of things, a gradual dissolution of the boundary between where you end and where the rest of the world begins. You may be feeling something like that now. The pillow beneath your head, the weight of the covers, the faint sounds of the building or the street settling into their own nighttime rhythms. These things are present, but they are soft and getting softer. Allow them to soften further. You are safe. The room is real. And the story we're moving into tonight is a story that has already ended, that ended 8,000 years before any of this. And whose ending is what makes all of this, the warmth, the stillness, the simple animal comfort of lying down in the dark, possible. The long night. The masters of the Citadel call it that with a kind of clinical remove that the actual experience would not have warranted. In the oral traditions of the peoples of Westeros, particularly those that survived in the far north, where the iron grip of the Andal faith never quite managed to fully displace the older stories, it is described with an immediacy that the academic name cannot capture. The oldest accounts, preserved in fragments and passed through the mouths of wildling elders from beyond the wall, speak of a generation that was born into darkness and died without ever seeing the sun. A full human generation, 25 years, perhaps 30, in which the stars were all that remained of the light, in which the seasons had collapsed into a single unending winter, in which the world had become a place of frozen mud and permanent shadow, and the sound of something vast and cold moving across the ice to the north. Imagine what it does to a civilization to lose the sun. Not for a week, not for a month, but for a generation. Agriculture becomes impossible. The animals that feed on grass and grain begin to die, and then the people who feed on those animals begin to weaken, and the social structures built around the ordinary rhythms of growing and harvesting and storing and sharing begin to fracture under the weight of a scarcity so profound that it has no historical precedent. The Long Night was not merely a weather event. It was an unmaking. It was the systematic removal of every condition that the human world of Westeros had organised itself around. What is rarely considered, in the standard telling of the Long Night, is what happened to the sky, not what the cold did to the earth. That much is documented, in the way that catastrophic things eventually get documented, through the oral traditions and the carved records and the bones in the soil that future generations interpret as evidence of mass death. But the sky, the permanent cloud cover that a global winter of that magnitude would have required, the absolute disappearance of the sun, not merely its weakening but its complete occlusion behind the grey-white ceiling of an atmosphere that had reorganised itself around the requirements of perpetual frost. The stars at night, perhaps. Those cold and reliable points of light that the children of the forest read as a different kind of text, a different kind of network. Information carried across distances that made even the Weirwood route seem local. But no sun, for a generation. And without the sun, the world was not merely dark. It was a different kind of place, a place in which the ordinary calibrations of time and season and the possibility of change had been suspended. The people of Westeros who survived the Long Night did so through means that the later traditions only partially preserved. They went underground where underground was possible. They followed the food south, along the routes that had always existed for the great migrations, until south itself began to mean something different. Until south became not a direction, but a desperate fiction, since the cold was moving in all directions simultaneously, and there was no warm country waiting at the bottom of the map. They burned things. They burned everything. The great forests that the children of the forest had maintained and protected and negotiated for. Those forests became fuel, because humans faced with extinction do not honour agreements about the trees. And in burning the forests, they were doing exactly what had provoked the Night King's making in the first place, and the cycle completed its next dark rotation. And through that darkness, the Night King moved. This is where the theological and the cosmic intersect, and where the question at the heart of this entire exploration begins to take shape. Because what was the Night King actually doing during the Long Night? The armies of the dead, the Whites, animated by his will, the White Walkers who served as his lieutenants, they moved south. They killed. They added the bodies of the fallen to their own ranks, so that the Long Night's army grew with every engagement, every village emptied, every battle won against the defenders of the living. This much is recorded, or at least mythologized, in every tradition that survived the period. But here is what is almost never asked. What was the Night King's actual objective? Not tactically, not where was he marching, what settlement was he targeting next, but cosmologically. What did the completion of his purpose look like if he had achieved it? What was the world that the Night King was building there in the dark, one frozen step at a time? Sit with this question for a moment rather than rushing past it. Because the answer, when you find it, is not what the surface narrative suggests. The Night King was not trying to conquer Westeros the way that Aegon Targaryen would later conquer Westeros. Not to rule, not to extract tribute, not to stamp his name onto the stone of the world and make it mean something. He had no use for names. He had no use for legacy in the ordinary sense, because he was already, in himself, the most durable form of legacy imaginable, a being who could not die, who could convert the dead to his cause, who could outlast every throne and every dynasty and every ambition that would ever unfold across this particular stretch of land. What the Night King was building slowly in the Long Night was a silence, a permanent, total, ecologically complete silence. Not death as an event, but death as a condition. A world from which the noisy, fractious, weirwood-cutting, forest-burning chaos of the living had been removed, and in its place, preserved forever, never decaying, held in the cold amber of his perpetual winter, the memory of everything that had ever lived. The whites were not merely soldiers, they were a record. Every human face in the army of the dead was a face that the Night King could, in theory, recall and examine, because the magic that animated them was the same magic that animated him, the magic of the Weirwood network, the magic of the children of the forest's oldest and deepest power, the magic of memory. Here is the thought that changes everything, the thought that is worth carrying with you into the soft country of sleep tonight. The Night King was not trying to destroy Westeros. He was trying to preserve it. He was trying to hold the world still, to stop the relentless churn of growth and death and regrowth that the living world represents, and to replace it with something permanent. He had been made from a human man and infused with the consciousness of an ancient tree network that contained 10,000 years of accumulated watching, and what that network had watched, over those 10,000 years, was the same cycle playing out again and again, people arriving, cutting the trees, building things, watching those things fall, cutting more trees. He had been made to stop the cycle. His method was just more absolute than his makers had intended. The long night lasted as long as it did not because the Night King was gathering power for some final apocalyptic push. It lasted as long as it did because the darkness was itself the achievement. Every day of permanent winter, every village that went silent, every fire that went out, this was the work. This was the world being slowly converted from a condition of noise and change to a condition of stillness and preservation. The Night King was, in his terrible way, the most successful conservationist in the history of the continent. He simply had a definition of conservation that excluded the living entirely. Daenerys Targaryen, 8,000 years after the Long Night, would carry within her the blood of the people who had helped end it. The Targaryens traced their lineage to old Valyria, which did not exist during the Long Night, but before that Valyrian lineage there were connections older and stranger, threads that the genealogists of the Citadel preferred not to follow too far back into the dark. The dragon fire that burned in Dany's blood, not metaphorically but literally, in the sense that she could withstand the heat that would kill any ordinary person, was the world's answer to the Night King's ice. Not politically, not dynastically, but cosmically. Fire to meet the cold, light to meet the darkness, the restless living heat of a dragon against the patient, accumulated stillness of 8,000 years of winter. When Dany looked north from Dragonstone and felt, without entirely being able to say why, that something up there needed to be burned, she was feeling the oldest argument in the history of Westeros asking to be settled. The Long Night also produced something that is easy to overlook when the narrative focus stays fixed on its horrors. It produced cooperation. For the first and perhaps only time in the history of Westeros before Jon Snow's fragile coalition thousands of years later, the peoples of the continent set aside the ordinary business of competing with each other and organised around a shared survival. The first men and the children of the forest, whose relationship had been defined by centuries of war and then by the careful, maintained distance of the pact, came together during the Long Night in a way that neither could have predicted. The heroes whose names the tradition preserved from this period, Azor Ahai, the last hero, Bran the Builder, the Grey King of the Iron Islands. These were not figures who had been collaborating for ideological reasons or dynastic ones. They had been driven together by the specific, clarifying pressure of a force so absolute that it made all their other conflicts look small. There is a lesson in that which the peoples of Westeros consistently failed to apply in the thousands of years that followed. The lesson is that cooperation at the scale necessary to survive an existential threat requires the threat to be legible. The Long Night was legible, it was dark, it was cold, it produced armies of the dead that walked through formerly inhabited villages. It was impossible to mistake for anything other than what it was. 8,000 years later, when the Night King began to move again, the threat was not yet legible to most of the people who most needed to respond to it, and the window between legibility and catastrophe was almost too narrow to survive. Jon Snow spent the entire middle portion of his story trying to make the threat legible to people who had every institutional and political incentive to dismiss it. He almost ran out of time. The Long Night ended. We will come to that in its own time, in its own quiet segment of this night's journey. But before it ended, it had already done what it was always going to do. It had shown the people of Westeros what the world looked like when one absolute force, cold, patient, ancient, uncompromising, was allowed to fill it entirely. And the people who survived it, who carried that knowledge forward in their blood and their stories and their carved-face Weirwood prayers, would build a wall to make sure that force was never allowed to fill the world again. They were not entirely wrong to build it, but they were wrong about what was on the other side of it, and that misunderstanding would cost them everything 8,000 years later when the ice began to move again. Rest now. The long night is behind us, or ahead of us. The time of this story is vast enough that those directions blur. Your body is warm, your breathing is even. The cold is a story, and stories, at their deepest level, are the warmest things we have. Let your eyes stay closed. Let the darkness behind them be exactly the darkness it is, not empty, not threatening, but full of the particular kind of rest that comes when you stop reaching for things. You've been breathing slowly now for some time, and your body knows what to do with that, knows how to use the quiet to begin its own long internal work of restoration. You do not need to direct it. You only need to stay here in this soft dark while the story continues. There is a figure at the centre of the long night's ending who is almost too archetypal to be believed, which is perhaps why the myths surrounding him are so varied and so contradictory. The last hero. In the oldest stories preserved in the north, he is a person of specific, painful ordinariness. Not a king, not a sorcerer, not a being of particular cosmic significance, but a man who went out into the dark because someone had to. He gathered companions, a horse, a dog, a sword of some kind, and other men and women whose names the tradition has not reliably preserved. And he walked north into the deepest cold of the long night, looking for the children of the forest. This is the element of the story that modern readers tend to slide past too quickly, and it deserves a longer moment of attention. The last hero was not marching north to fight the Night King. He was not leading an army. He was looking for the children of the forest, those same beings who had, in their terror and their grief, created the Night King in the first place. He was going to the makers of the catastrophe to ask them for help in ending it. And this, the willingness to go back to the source of the wound, to look at the people who caused the suffering and ask them anyway, because they were the only ones who might know the cure. This is one of the most emotionally complex moments in the entire mythology of the world of Ice and Fire. The journey did not go well by any account. The companions died one by one as the winter took them. The horse died. The dog, reportedly, was the last to go, and the image of a man alone in the ice with only his dog in the kind of cold that was not merely weather but intention, is one of those details that lands in the chest rather than the mind. At some point, apparently, the sword broke. The masters who later attempted to rationalise this myth suggested that the broken sword was what led to the eventual tradition of Valyrian steel and dragonglass as the only materials capable of truly killing White Walkers, that the last hero's ordinary sword failed. Because ordinary swords always fail against something that has been made out of older and stranger materials than iron. Eventually, by means that the surviving accounts do not clearly explain, and perhaps the lack of explanation is itself meaningful, perhaps the how of the meeting between the last hero and the children was too strange or too sacred to be put into ordinary words, the alliance was formed. The children of the forest agreed to help the living world, even though the living world had been the reason the Night King existed, even though the First Men's axe-bearing expansion had been the crisis that drove the children to create their weapon in the first place. They agreed to help end what they had started. There is a kind of grace in that decision that is worth pausing to acknowledge. The grace of a being who says, I created this catastrophe, I built this weapon that is now consuming the world, and I will not hide behind that fact and call the consequences someone else's problem. I will return to the wound and put my hands in it and help close it. This is the rarest kind of moral courage, not the courage of the battlefield, which is spectacular and legible, but the courage of admission and repair, which is quiet and almost invisible, but which is the only courage that actually changes anything. The dragonglass weapons that ended the long night, the specific material fact of obsidian as the substance capable of killing White Walkers, connect the closing of the long night to its opening in a way that is almost liturgical. The same material that had been pressed into the Night King's heart to make him was the material that could unmake the beings he had created. This is not coincidence. In the world of ice and fire, magic is not arbitrary. It operates according to rules that are consistent even when they are not fully understood by the people operating within them. The dragonglass was the medium of transformation in both directions, the transformation of a man into a Night King, and the transformation of a White Walker back into the nothing from which it had been made. It was the key to both the lock and its undoing. Sam Tarly found dragonglass at the Fist of the First Men, which was one of the earliest strongholds of the Night's Watch beyond the wall. The cache of dragonglass buried there was not an accident. It had been placed deliberately by people who understood what it was for, in a location that the Watch's rangers would eventually find if they ranged far enough and looked carefully enough. This was a message, left by someone who understood the long game in a way that the Citadel no longer did. Someone who knew that the information about dragonglass needed to be preserved not in text, which burned, but in object, which persisted. Someone who was thinking on a timescale that matched the Night King's own. The wall was built after the long night ended, and here is where the standard interpretation begins to crack slightly under the weight of a more careful examination. The standard reading of the wall, the reading that the Night's Watch itself, in its ceremonies and its vows, has maintained for 8,000 years, is that the wall was built to keep the White Walkers out, to hold the ice and the army of the dead on one side and the warmth of the living world on the other, a barrier, a defence, the largest defensive structure in the history of Westeros. But there is another reading. The wall is not merely made of ice. It is, according to the older traditions, infused with spells, specifically with a magic so deep and so ancient that even the Meisters, who are constitutionally suspicious of magic, acknowledge that something is different about the wall beyond its physical properties. The ice of the wall is not simply compacted snow and frozen water. It has a quality that resists, that repels, that maintains itself over millennia without the kind of maintenance that any merely physical structure would require. Something is alive in the wall, or something was placed inside it at its making. Something that has been slowly persisting, and watching, and holding a line for 8,000 years. The wall, in this reading, is not a prison wall. It is a treaty wall. It marks not just a physical boundary, but a negotiated limit, a line that was agreed upon, not merely imposed. The Night King, by this interpretation, was not locked out of the south. He withdrew to the north as part of the agreement that ended the Long Night, an agreement sealed not with paper or with a handshake, but with an enchantment placed in the very substance of the wall itself. The Night King had not been defeated. He had been negotiated with. He had agreed to stay because the terms of his staying gave him something he wanted. The wilderness beyond the wall, untouched, uncultivated, held in a permanent condition of cold and isolation. His silence maintained, his territory respected. If this reading is correct, and the evidence scattered through the canon of asoiaf supports it more than the conventional interpretation admits, then the Night's Watch was never guarding against an attack from the north. It was maintaining the terms of a treaty that no one any longer fully understood. Every man who took the black and went to man the wall was, in a very real sense, a treaty negotiator who did not know he was negotiating. The ravens, the patrols, the fires kept burning in the darkness. These were not military operations, they were signals. They were the living world's way of saying, we remember the agreement. We are still holding to our side. Jon Snow, taking his vows in the Godswood in the dark and speaking the words of the Night's Watch, night gathers and now my watch begins, was, in this light, participating in a ceremony far older and far stranger than the institution that administered it had ever acknowledged. He was renewing a compact with winter itself. He was standing at the edge of the agreed territory and saying, in the language of solemn ritual, I know you are there. I acknowledge the line. I will hold it. This is perhaps why Jon's particular kind of courage, patient, stubborn, willing to walk into the cold rather than away from it, felt throughout the entire arc of the story, less like heroism and more like keeping a promise. Bran the Builder, who superintended the construction of the wall, is a figure so obscured by time that the Maesters cannot even confidently confirm that he was a single person rather than a title or a tradition. The folklore that surrounds him is consistent in its broad outlines, a builder of surpassing genius, responsible not only for the wall, but for the original Winterfell, for Storm's End, for structures whose durability across thousands of years suggests a working knowledge of magical reinforcement that the Andals later disrupted, and the Meisters later refused to acknowledge. He was, in the oldest traditions, a king of the first men who understood something about the relationship between built structures and the magical energies of the land that no subsequent architect, however talented, managed to replicate. The wall that Bran built was 300 miles long and 700 feet high, which is a scale so excessive for a purely military fortification that it requires explanation. You do not build a wall 700 feet high to stop human raiders. The wildlings, formidable as they were, did not require a barrier of that magnitude to keep south of. A fraction of that height would have served the military purpose adequately. The wall's actual height, the decision to build it to a scale that approached the mythological, suggests that its builders understood it needed to function at a mythological level, as well as a physical one. It was not a wall for stopping armies. It was a monument for sealing an agreement, a physical expression of a negotiated boundary large enough to be legible to a consciousness that thought on a geological scale, a gentle heaviness. That is what you may be feeling now, as the story settles into its deeper registers and the night continues its slow, reliable work. The wall stands. It has been standing for 8,000 years, which is a persistence so absolute that it begins to feel less like architecture and more like a natural feature of the world, like a mountain range or a coastline. And in that persistence, in that patient, enchanted, cold blue maintenance of the line, there is something almost comforting. The knowledge that even the most terrible agreements can be honoured, that even the most absolute forces can be negotiated with, if the negotiation happens at the right moment, between the right people, with the right understanding of what is actually being asked, if the terms are not remembered, if the watch breaks. But those are the next questions, and they belong to the next quiet movement of this night. For now, the wall holds, and the night is soft, and your breathing is steady, and you are already moving without effort towards sleep. If you're still here, still breathing slowly in the dark, then you have already done the most important thing. You have stayed. You have allowed the noise of the waking world to recede far enough that something quieter and older can be heard. That is all that sleep asks ultimately. Not that you force it, not that you command your mind to go still, but that you stay present with the stillness that is already trying to arrive. The story continues, the history deepens, and as it does, the body keeps its own patient counsel, growing heavier, growing quieter, sinking by small degrees into the warmth that has always been waiting beneath the thinking surface of the night. If you were to visit the Night's Watch in the age of Jon Snow, to arrive at Castle Black and observe its dwindling garrison and its crumbling towers and its largely ceremonial relationship with the wall it was supposedly defending, you would encounter a peculiar institution. You would find men who had memorized the words of their vows without knowing their original meaning. You would find a tradition of ranging beyond the wall that was in practice more archaeology than reconnaissance, a probing of ruins and empty wilderness that had forgotten what it was originally supposed to be looking for. You would find brothers who feared the cold and the dark without being entirely certain why the fear felt so much older and heavier than the specific immediate dangers of the wilderness justified. 8,000 years is a very long time to maintain an institution. The Night's Watch had been founded immediately after the Long Night, when the memory of what the darkness had been was still raw in the mouths of grandparents and great-grandparents who had lived through it or been told of it by those who had. In those early centuries, the Watch would have been an organisation of genuine urgency, manned by people who understood, in a visceral and inherited way, what was on the other side of the wall and why the line mattered. The vows would have felt weighted with specific meaning. The fires kept burning on the wall would have been maintained with a precision born of genuine understanding rather than mere tradition. But civilizations have a particular relationship with their own urgencies. The catastrophe that galvanizes a generation is the mythology that puzzles its grandchildren, and the folk superstition that bores its great-grandchildren. The Long Night, over the course of 8,000 years, made this journey completely. By the time of the Andal invasion, which brought not only new people but a new religion, the Faith of the Seven, which explicitly dismissed the old gods and the Weirwood network as primitive superstition, the Long Night had already been reduced from recent trauma to ancient legend. And with the Andals came a new intellectual culture, the Meisters of the Citadel, who systematically elevated empirical rationalism and systematically devalued the oral traditions and magical understandings that had preserved the truest memory of what the Night King actually was. The Meisters were not malicious. This is worth stating carefully, because it is easy to cast them as villains in the retrospective light of what their dismissiveness cost Westeros. But they were doing what rational institutions always do when confronted with evidence that does not fit their frameworks. They categorized it, and in categorizing it, they diminished it. The Long Night became a myth, and myths were assigned to the category of pre-rational culture, and pre-rational culture was assigned to the category of things that educated people had moved beyond. The result was that the only intellectual institution in Westeros capable of synthesizing information at scale, the Citadel and its chain-linked network of maesters in every castle and holdfast, was also the institution most committed to not believing in the thing that was coming. Samwell Tarly felt this as a specific grinding frustration throughout the later portion of his journey. Sam, who had read more about the White Walkers than almost any living person, who had handled the records and understood the patterns, who had been beyond the wall and seen the army of the dead with his own eyes, Sam went to the Citadel with the urgent hope that the maesters would listen, would synthesize his knowledge with their own resources, would respond to an existential threat with the full mobilizing weight of their collective intelligence. And what he found instead was an institution that had spent 8,000 years constructing increasingly sophisticated reasons not to believe in the very thing he had come to report. The tragedy was not that the maesters were stupid. It was that they were brilliant in the service of a framework that excluded the single most important truth of their age. The Night's Watch itself was a mirror of this broader institutional decay. Its founding purpose, the maintenance of the treaty with Winter, the holding of the line, the careful tending of signals that said to whatever watched from the north, "We remember, we are here, the agreement stands," had been replaced, by the time of Jon Snow, with a much simpler and much less accurate story, Monster Patrol. The Watch existed, in its own self-understanding, to stop the wildlings from raiding south, and to warn against the occasional White Walker sighting that most of its members privately suspected was exaggerated or mythologized. The wildlings in this reduced understanding were the actual threat. The White Walkers were the campfire story told to scare new recruits. Mance Rayder understood something about this that the Watch, as an institution, had entirely lost. Mance had been a crow, had been beyond the wall, and what he had found there had told him everything he needed to know about the relative scale of threats. The wildlings were not massing south of the wall because they were aggressive or acquisitive, they were fleeing. They were running from something that the Watch did not yet believe in, and in their running they had run into the wall and found it locked against them, and so they had organised, under Mance's long patient diplomacy, for the only purpose that has ever successfully unified groups of people who hate each other: collective survival in the face of an extinction-level event. What Mance was doing, seen from a certain angle, was what the last hero had done 8,000 years before. He was looking for allies in a world that had not yet accepted that it needed them. He was assembling, from the fractious and the suspicious and the mutually antagonistic free folk, something that looked superficially like an invasion but was actually a refugee movement of continental significance. And the institution that was supposed to understand this, the Night's Watch, keeper of the ancient understanding, guardian of the treaty, that had never been properly explained to its own members, looked at Mance's army of wildlings and saw exactly what its institutionally narrowed vision allowed it to see: a threat from without, rather than a population fleeing a threat from beyond. Jon Snow was the specific product of a long lineage of people who were good at holding contradictions. His father, in one sense Ned Stark, and in another and deeper sense Rhaegar Targaryen, his father, in both versions, was a man who had chosen what was true over what was easy, and had paid for that choice with everything. Jon's entire arc in the Night's Watch was the arc of a person trying to hold open a space for a more complete understanding against the pressure of an institution that wanted him to see less. He let the wildlings through at Hardhome. He looked at the people the Watch was supposed to keep out and said, "The wall was not built for this. The wall was built for what is coming behind them." In doing so, he was doing something that no Lord Commander of the Night's Watch had done in living memory. He was remembering, without access to the original records, without the benefit of any surviving tradition that correctly named what the Watch was for, the actual purpose of the thing he was guarding. He was reconstructing the treaty from first principles, from evidence, from the specific pressure of the reality pressing against the wall. He was being, in the most literal sense, the Watch. Not the ceremony of it, not the vow of it, not the cold and hungry and diminished institution of it, but the actual function, the standing at the edge of the agreed territory and looking north and saying, "I see you, I know you are there, I will hold the line." There is a particular sadness in the story of the Night's Watch as an institution, separate from and alongside the sadness of the Night King's own story, and it is the sadness of a purpose outlasting the understanding that gave the purpose meaning. The men who built the watch, who wrote the vows, who chose the words, "Night gathers, and now my watch begins," those men knew what the words meant. They had context for every syllable. The night that gathered was a specific night they had lived through. The watch that was beginning was a specific vigil against a specific presence. The words were precise because the experience that shaped them was precise. 8,000 years of inheritance without understanding produced a different kind of man than the founders had intended. It produced men who were performing the ceremony without knowing its theology, maintaining the structure without knowing what the structure was designed to contain. This is not a failure of individual intelligence or individual courage. The Night's Watch included men of considerable ability throughout its long history. It is a failure of institutional memory, the specifically slow and specifically inevitable erosion that occurs when the reasons behind rituals are considered less important than the rituals themselves. Ghost was always present at the boundary between understanding and instinct. Jon's direwolf, white, silent, red-eyed, operating at a register that bypassed the analytical and went directly to the knowing, Ghost responded to the White Walkers before Jon did, before the Watch, as an institution, had adequately processed what it was seeing. The direwolves knew, the ravens knew, the horses, whose behaviour at Hardhome before the attack was the first reliable indicator of what was coming, knew. The living world's alarm system was intact. The institution designed to respond to it had simply stopped listening. The Maester's ravens deserve particular mention in this context, because they represent another layer of the same paradox. Ravens were associated with the old magic, with the Green Seer tradition, with the Weirwood network, with the children of the forest and the older ways of knowing that the Citadel had systematically marginalised. Ravens were also the Maester's primary communication infrastructure. The Citadel had adopted the old magic's most visible symbol as the backbone of its information network, while simultaneously dismissing the tradition that had originally domesticated those ravens and understood what they were for. The ravens tolerated this arrangement with the particular patient contempt of creatures that have outlived every civilization that has ever tried to fully understand them. The three-eyed raven that visited Bran's dreams, that guided him north, that communicated across the barrier of waking and sleeping with an insistence that suggested genuine urgency, was not a bird in any ordinary sense. It was the network itself, reaching out through the medium of a dreaming child's mind, because the dreaming mind is the most permeable to the kind of slow, root-deep communication that the network's consciousness generates. Bran was not unusual in receiving these communications. He was unusual in being able to follow them all the way to their source, to travel north into the cold and find the cave beneath the Weirwood and accept what was being asked of him. The fire in the hearth grows lower as you drift. Not dangerously, only lower, the way fires do when the night has gone on long enough, and the wood has done its patient work. The room is warm enough without it, and will remain so. You are warm enough. Your breathing is the only clock that matters now, and it is running slow and steady and true. The watch may have forgotten what it was guarding, but the thing it was guarding did not forget the watch, and in that mutual asymmetric memory, one side clear and cold and ancient, the other dimmed and bureaucratic and fragile, the next 8,000 years were being quietly arranged. Rest now. The understanding will keep. The history will be here in the morning, exactly as deep and exactly as patient as it has always been. There is a quality to deep night that ordinary speech cannot reach. You may have touched it before, those moments between waking and sleeping when language thins out and something else moves through, something more like image or sensation, or the memory of a feeling rather than the feeling itself. We are in that country now, you and this story and the slow dark surrounding you both. The words will come because words are all we have for the journey, but underneath them something older is carrying you, something that does not need language at all. Allow it to carry. Allow the words to float on top of it like leaves on moving water. One of the most revealing aspects of the Night King's behaviour, across both the television series and the deep lore of the books, is that he never speaks. Not once. In a world defined by negotiation, by the spoken word, by the specific power of a name, and the specific danger of a promise, the Night King maintains an absolute silence that is not the silence of inability, but the silence of a different kind of communication entirely. He does not need words. He has another language, and it is a language that has no shortage of speakers: the dead. When Jon Snow stands on the cliffs beyond Hardhome and watches the Night King raise his arms, watches the fresh dead rise from the ground at that gesture, a gesture that is almost liturgical in its unhurried authority, he is witnessing a mode of communication so ancient and so complete that it makes the spoken word look primitive. The Night King raised his arms, and every person who had just died understood in the same instant everything they needed to know about their new existence. No orientation, no explanation, no command structure, simply the direct transmission of purpose through whatever channel connects him to the dead he animates. He spoke to them in the language of his making, the language of the Weirwood network, transmitted not through roots and bark, but through the cold architecture of his altered will. The show gives us one moment of genuine communication between Jon Snow and the Night King, and it is entirely conducted without words. Jon stands on the shore, survivors at his back, boats departing, and the Night King walks to the edge of the dock and looks at him, just looks. And in that look, which the director chose to hold for several full seconds, an eternity in television time, an entire conversation takes place. The Night King is saying, "I know what you are. I know what you are trying to do. I know the world you are trying to protect. And you should know that I have been doing this for 8,000 years, and I am not stopping," Jon says, with his expression, with the particular set of his jaw and the way he does not run. "I know, and I'm not stopping either." This is, stripped to its essentials, the same conversation that the last hero had in whatever dark cave or frozen grove he finally found the children of the forest in. The meeting of two wills at the edge of their respective territories. The acknowledgement that neither side is going anywhere. The opening of a negotiation that neither party has yet named as such. The White Walkers themselves speak a language, or something that functions like a language, called scroth in the books, described as a sound like cracking ice, like the sound that very cold, very thick ice makes when it shifts on the surface of a lake. The Maesters dismiss scroth as mythology, as the kind of detail that gets added to monster stories to make them feel more real. But the linguistic specificity of it, the fact that it was named, that it was described with that precise sensory detail of cracking ice, that the tradition remembered not just that the White Walkers communicated, but how their communication sounded. This suggests that the people who had actual encounters with White Walkers before the wall was built were paying a different quality of attention than the people who recorded those encounters centuries later. What does it mean that the White Walkers speak with the sound of ice moving? Ice moves very slowly. The smallest appreciable movement of a glacier takes decades. The creak of ice on a lake surface is the language of a process measured in centuries, in the slow millimetric compression of frozen water into something that is almost crystalline mineral, rather than mere frozen weather. If scroth sounds like cracking ice, then it is a language calibrated to a speed of thought and purpose that human beings experience only in their longest institutions. In the way that a cathedral takes 300 years to build, or a forest takes 1,000 years to return after a fire, or a mountain range takes 10 million years to form. The Night King was not thinking on a human timescale. He was thinking on a geological one, and from inside a geological timescale, the entire history of human civilization in Westeros, from the first men's arrival to the War of the Five Kings, was a single noisy afternoon. It is worth sitting with that for a breath. From the Night King's perspective, Jon Snow was not a formidable adversary who had been gathering allies and riding dragons and brooding magnificently at the problem for years. From the Night King's perspective, Jon Snow had appeared roughly 45 seconds ago. The urgency that Jon felt, the desperate, exhausted, morally heavy urgency of a person who believed the clock was running out, was not something the Night King shared, because the Night King did not experience the passing of human-scale time as urgency. He experienced it the way a mountain experiences rain, as something that happens and changes the surface of things slightly and eventually stops. This is why the Night King's patience is the most terrifying thing about him, more terrifying than his army or his ice spears or his ability to reanimate the dead. He could wait. He had been waiting for 8,000 years already. Whatever had kept him north of the wall for that span of time, the treaty, or the enchantment in the wall, or some calculation of his own that the time was not yet right, he had honoured it, or abided by it, or simply found it not yet worth the energy to override. 8,000 years of patience is not inaction. It is the deepest possible form of confidence. It is the behaviour of a being who is absolutely certain that it will outlast whatever stands between it and its purpose. And yet he was communicating throughout those 8,000 years in the only language available to a being of his nature. The seasons themselves, the length of the winters, every winter that was slightly longer than the last, every autumn that came a week earlier than expected, every summer that felt faintly, subtly wrong in its heat. This was the Night King's version of a diplomatic message. He was saying, I am still here, I am still moving. The terms are still in effect, but they are in effect because I have chosen not to violate them yet, and you should probably be maintaining your side of the agreement with more rigour than you currently are. The masters had in fact noticed the pattern of lengthening winters. They had charted it with their obsessive archival precision, those chains of different metals marking different fields of knowledge, those ravens carrying data from castle to castle across the continent. They had the numbers, they had the trend, they had, in the accumulated records of the Citadel, everything they needed to understand what the lengthening winters meant. And they had concluded, with the certainty of an institution committed to natural explanations, that it was probably a long cycle of climatic variation that would eventually correct itself. They had the message. They did not have the code for reading it. Settle deeper now. The language of ice is very slow and very patient, and in the quiet of sleep it is almost possible to hear it, not as a threat, not as a warning, but as the sound of the oldest part of the world saying something in a register just below the threshold of ordinary waking ears, the creak of a glacier, the slow blue shift of ancient ice, the almost imperceptible settling of something that has been holding a weight for a very long time. The long night itself was, in retrospect, a sentence in this language, a very long, very complex sentence, spoken over the course of a generation, but a sentence nonetheless. It had a subject, the Night King. It had a verb, the movement south, the expansion of the cold, the conversion of the living to the dead. And it had a direct object, the civilization that had forgotten the terms of the original agreement. The long night was a declaration, written in snow and darkness and silence, that the agreement was no longer being honoured from the southern side of the wall, that the conditions that had made the agreement necessary in the first place, the cutting of the forests, the expansion into the territory that the Pact had designated as belonging to the old world, were being violated, and the cold was the response. What is heartbreaking about this, if heartbreaking is the right word for something operating at this scale, is that the people most devastated by the long night were not the ones who had broken the agreement. The children of the forest had broken it first, by creating the Night King. The Night King had exceeded his mandate, and the Andal invaders who had systematically cut the Weirwoods and replaced the old gods with the Seven would have been, from the Night King's perspective, the most egregious violators of the ancient compact. But the Night King had been patient for a very long time, and when he finally moved, he moved against a population that included many people who had maintained the old ways with as much fidelity as the changed world permitted. Ned Stark's ancestors prayed at their heart tree. They remembered what they could. It was not enough, but they tried. Jon Snow understood something about communication across species that his training had not explicitly taught him, but that his nature seemed to grasp instinctively. His ability to sit across a fire or across a chasm from something utterly different from himself, a wildling, a giant, eventually the Night King himself at Hardhome, and to maintain eye contact and hold the space of the encounter without flinching, was not simply courage. It was a form of listening. He was not understanding the scroth, not comprehending the language of cracking ice, but he was communicating his own availability to the encounter, his own willingness to be present with whatever was being said, even when the language was beyond him. This is perhaps the most important quality a diplomat can have, and Jon Snow was an accidental diplomat of the highest order. There is a version of the Night King's southward march that looks, through the lens of the language it was written in, less like an invasion and more like a final unambiguous demand for acknowledgement. 8,000 years of lengthening winters had not produced the response the cold was looking for. The pact's terms had been eroded so gradually that the people living inside the erosion could not perceive the shape of it. The message had been sent continuously for 8 millennia in the only register available, the slow geological language of climate, and had been received as noise, as natural variation, as something the maesters could chart without reading. And so the Night King came south himself, came in person, in the body he'd been given, to deliver the message directly. You have forgotten. You have been forgetting for a very long time, and the cold is done waiting for you to remember on your own. Whether that constitutes a form of mercy, by the Night King's own standards, is a question without a comfortable answer. It would be far easier to dismiss him as simply a force of destruction, a power without interiority, a weapon that outlived its purpose and continued operating past the point of any possible justification. But the evidence of the law, examined carefully, resists that dismissal. Something was in there. Something had been making decisions, calibrating responses, exercising what could only be called patience for 8,000 years. Something had looked at the Andal invasion and the collapse of the old ways and the systematic cutting of the Weirwood south of the Neck, and chosen at that moment not to move. Something had waited. And whatever waited in the cold and the silence and the patient dark beyond the wall was not nothing. It was not merely absence. It was the most ancient kind of presence, the kind that does not announce itself, the kind that simply persists until the world has no choice but to notice. Allow that sound to carry you. Allow the patience of ice to be a comfort rather than a cold thing. You are warm, you are still, and the deepest kind of patience, the patience of sleep, the patience of the body that knows exactly how to rest without being told. That patience is yours right now, and it is asking only that you surrender to it. Let it take you. The story will hold until morning. You have come far tonight, far from the surface of the day, far from the ordinary geography of your thoughts and your plans and your unresolved smaller things. The country you're in now is the country of deep rest, where the body's own intelligence takes over, and the mind's ordinary management relaxes its grip, and the whole mechanism of being alive is given over to the quiet, highly competent machinery of the body's own restoration. You do not need to do anything. You only need to continue not doing. Continue being still. Continue allowing the breath to move on its own, which it has been doing all night, which it has been doing your entire life without asking for your supervision. There are 2 powers in the world of ice and fire that stand in a relationship to time that no human being can quite replicate. The first is the Night King, a being of ice and Weirwood memory, capable of moving forward through time while simultaneously remaining connected to the vast accumulated past of the Weirwood network, his consciousness extended across centuries in both directions. The second is the three-eyed raven, the peculiar institution, or individual or accumulated series of individuals that occupied the cave beneath the great Weirwood north of the wall, the being who trained Bran Stark in the use of his green sight, the presence that described itself as having waited for Bran for 1,000 years. These 2 figures are, on the surface, opposites. One is the force that the living world of Westeros has been defending against for 8,000 years. The other is the ancient wisdom tradition that prepared the last Greenseer to face that force. But when you look at them from a slight distance, when you step back far enough to see the shape of them against the larger canvas of the world's history, what you find is not a simple opposition but something far stranger, a mirror. Both the Night King and the three-eyed raven are products of the same power. Both are beings who have been fundamentally altered by the Weirwood network, who have had the ordinary boundaries of individual human consciousness dissolved and replaced by something much larger and much older. The three-eyed raven was a Greenseer who had pressed himself so deeply into the Weirwood network over so many centuries that he had become, in some meaningful sense, more tree than man. His physical form, when Bran found him, was barely distinguishable from the roots of the Weirwood he sat within. He was warm where the Night King was cold, anchored where the Night King moved, capable of speech where the Night King was silent. But these were differences of character, not of kind. They were 2 expressions of the same ancient transformation. The cave where the three-eyed raven waited for Bran was not incidentally located beneath a Weirwood. It was constitutively located there. The old man and the tree had grown into each other in the way that vine and stone grow into each other over sufficient centuries, until separating them would mean destroying both. The cave was warm, improbably warm for a location so far north, warmed by whatever old magic the Weirwood roots generated in their deep, slow conversion of experience into memory. Bran arrived there cold and nearly dead, and was warmed by the same network that had, in its other expression, sent a continent into perpetual winter. The Weirwood gave warmth and it gave cold. It preserved and it consumed. It was the same network, operating through two different consciousnesses that had each, in their own way, been remade by it. The Night King had been transformed involuntarily, violently, against his will and against the will of the man whose body was used. The three-eyed raven had been transformed willingly, over centuries, by the gradual process of deepening greensight meditation. But both transformations used the same mechanism, the Weirwood network and its 10,000 years of accumulated memory. Both beings emerged from the transformation with a relationship to time and knowledge that ordinary human consciousness cannot access, and both, as a result of this transformation, had become beings whose primary concern was not the present moment, but the shape of the long arc of history. The three-eyed raven told Bran, in those underground teaching sessions, that he would fly. He told Bran that he would never walk again. He communicated in the precise, selective, sometimes maddeningly oblique way of a being who can see all of time but is choosing, for reasons of its own, to reveal only portions of it. This selectivity, this careful curation of what to show and what to withhold, is the most unsettling thing about the three-eyed raven, more unsettling even than his physical transformation. It implies a level of calculation that exceeds ordinary wisdom. It implies that he was not merely teaching Bran, but positioning him, moving him, like a piece, toward a specific outcome on a board that Bran himself could not yet see. It is worth sitting with this for a moment, because it implicates the three-eyed raven in a way that the narrative largely allows him to escape. He had waited for Bran for 1,000 years. 1,000 years is long enough to know, with the confidence of a confirmed greenseer, that Bran was coming. Long enough to know what Bran would need to do. Long enough to have prepared, if preparation were possible, something that might help. And yet the three-eyed raven sent Bran into his confrontation with the Night King with the most minimal possible preparation. Just enough sight, just enough knowledge, to survive the encounter and emerge from it as something new. Just enough, and no more. This is not the pedagogy of a teacher. It is the economy of a designer. The Night King, for his part, seemed to know about the three-eyed raven in a way that went beyond tactical intelligence. When he led his army directly to the cave beneath the Weirwood, he was not simply following Bran and the ravens. He was going to a specific place with a specific purpose, the elimination of the three-eyed raven. The institution, not merely the individual. He wanted to destroy the capacity for accumulated greensight memory in the living world, to close the window through which the past could be seen clearly and therefore used. Because a world that cannot see clearly into its own past is a world that cannot adequately understand its present threats. A world without the three-eyed raven is a world that has lost its ability to know what the Night King actually is. In killing the three-eyed raven, the Night King was not destroying an enemy in the ordinary military sense. He was destroying a competing relationship to history. He was eliminating the only consciousness in the living world that shared to some extent his own temporal perspective. The only being who could look at the Night King and see him not as a monster, but as an event, not as an aberration, but as a consequence, not as something to be defeated militarily, but as something to be understood cosmically. Once the three-eyed raven was gone, the living world's capacity for that understanding went with him, and the next three-eyed raven, Bran, was still in training. Daenerys, watching from the air on Dragonback, could not have understood the philosophical weight of what was happening in that cave below her. She was there to fight a battle. The battle was real and urgent, and she was fighting it well. But the actual confrontation taking place was not between her dragons and the Night King's dead. It was between two ancient ways of being in a world defined by time. The Night King's way, which was to stop time, to preserve it, to hold the world in amber, and the three-eyed raven's way, which was to see all of time, to move through it, to use its patterns to navigate the present. These were the two positions available to beings who had been transformed by the Weirwood network, and they were incompatible with each other, and only one of them could persist. Bran Stark, by the end of the series, had become the third version, a synthesis that neither of his predecessors had quite achieved. He carried the three-eyed raven's capacity for seeing all of time, but he had done it while remaining, technically, alive and embodied and human-shaped. He had not retreated into the roots, had not let the network fully absorb him. He sat in his chair and he looked out from behind those still, blue-tinted eyes. And yes, the eyes are worth noticing. Those grey eyes that had taken on a quality that other characters consistently found unsettling, a quality very like the quality of the Night King's own gaze, present and total, and somehow looking at something that was not in the room. And he held the whole weight of history inside him without being consumed by it. Whether this constituted victory, or merely a new kind of accommodation with the thing that had always been there, watching from the cold, is a question that the story declines to definitively answer. Bran Stark, by the end of the series, had become the third version, a synthesis that neither of his predecessors had quite achieved. He carried the three-eyed raven's capacity for seeing all of time, but he had done it while remaining technically alive and embodied and human-shaped. He had not retreated into the roots, had not let the network fully absorb him. He sat in his chair and he looked out from behind those still, blue-tinted eyes, and yes, the eyes are worth noticing. Those grey eyes that had taken on a quality that other characters consistently found unsettling, a quality very like the quality of the Night King's own gaze, present and total, and somehow looking at something that was not in the room, and he held the whole weight of history inside him without being consumed by it. The question that the show's ending declines to fully answer is whether Bran's resolution of the Night King problem was a genuine ending, or simply a new phase of the same ancient argument. Bran saw all of time. He saw the Night King coming. He allowed himself to be used as bait in the Godswood, positioned at the Heart Tree, the specific symbolic locus of the Weirwood network's presence in the living world, where the Night King would inevitably come to find him. And the Night King came, as Bran knew he would, and Arya arrived from the dark, as Bran presumably knew she would, and the Night King shattered. But Bran, who could see all of time, also knew what came after. He knew what the living world would do with the peace that followed. He knew whether the lesson would be learned this time, or whether the cycle would simply continue, with a new Night King forming in some future iteration of the same old desperation, a new Long Night building in some future generation that had once again forgotten the terms of the original agreement. And Bran, sitting the Iron Throne at the end of the story with his enormous patient eyes, was not telling. He sat there, and he held what he knew, and he looked at the world and said nothing that would spoil it, and the world went back to its ordinary business of competing and forgetting. Bran's decision to allow himself to be used as bait in the Godswood, to sit in his chair before the Heart Tree while the battle raged in the dark around him, trusting that Arya would arrive because he had seen that she would arrive, was the three-eyed raven's methodology applied at its most distilled. He did not fight. He did not strategize in the ordinary military sense. He held himself still at the exact centre of the thing that the Night King was coming for, and he waited, and he trusted the process of what he had become. This is not a human way of responding to mortal danger. It is the Weirwood way. It is the mode of a consciousness that has internalized 10,000 years of history, deeply enough to trust that the pattern, once seen, can be relied upon. The Night King came to destroy the repository of memory. The repository of memory let him come. And the thing that destroyed the Night King was the one element that no repository of memory could have predicted, because she had spent years making herself unpredictable. Let the question rest. You do not need to resolve it tonight. The most important questions are the ones that remain open, that create a space of genuine wondering, rather than a closure that satisfies but doesn't quite fit. Let this one be open. Let the room be quiet around it. Your breathing has found its own level now, slow and reliable and entirely automatic, the body's oldest intelligence doing what it has always done in the dark. There is nothing to work out. There is nowhere to go. The three-eyed raven and the Night King are watching each other across the depth of history, and you are a warm living thing in the middle of their long argument, and the warmth of you is answer enough. The night has reached its deepest point, not the darkest. Darkness is a quality of light and has nothing to do with depth, but the deepest, in the way that a lake has a deepest point that is not darker than the shallows, but simply farther from the surface. You're at that depth now. The thoughts that arise, if any arise at all, come slowly and without urgency, like objects settling through water. They are not important. Nothing is important right now except the slow movement of air in and out of the body that carries you, and the warmth, and the soft dark, and this voice carrying you gently further into the oldest story in the world of ice and fire. We have established through the accumulated understanding of these previous segments that the Night King was made from the Weirwood network and from a man in equal and terrible measure. We have considered what his purpose was, the preservation of silence, the end of the cycle of growth and destruction and regrowth. And we have noted that his patience was geological, his perspective temporal on a scale that makes human ambition look like weather. But there is one more dimension to the Night King that is rarely examined, and it is perhaps the most haunting of all. What exactly was inside him? The Weirwood network, at its fullest extent during the age of the Children of the Forest, was the accumulated memory of tens of thousands of years of greenseer observation. Every significant event that had taken place anywhere within range of a face-carved weirwood had been recorded in the network. Every birth, every death, every war, every treaty, every conversation beside a fire at the edge of a clearing in the haunted forest. The network was the world's autobiography, written continuously in a medium that did not decay, that did not require translation, that was preserved not in the fragile medium of parchment, or the even more fragile medium of oral tradition, but in the living wood of trees that could persist for thousands of years without deteriorating. When the Night King was made, the dragonglass was pressed against his heart with the intentional purpose of weaponizing this network. The idea was that his connection to the network would give him tactical awareness, would make him a military asset capable of coordinating across large distances, would transform a single human combatant into something more like a distributed consciousness, capable of fighting everywhere at once. But the unintended consequence of the transformation was that the Night King did not merely gain tactical access to the Weirwood network. He carried its entire memory inside him. The Night King was, in this sense, the living library of Westeros. Everything the Weirwoods had seen, he had seen. Every face of every person who had ever knelt before a heart tree and prayed, or wept, or confessed something they could not say to any living person. Those faces, those moments, those precise configurations of grief and relief and desperate hope were inside him, part of the vast archive that his consciousness extended across. He was walking through the world and he carried the world inside him. This is not a comfortable thing to be. It may, in fact, be an unbearable thing to be. Consider what it would mean to hold 10,000 years of human memory in a consciousness that was also responsible for the extermination of the beings that memory belonged to. Every person whose white form the Night King animated in his army of the dead, he knew them. He had, through the network, seen them at their most private, their most vulnerable, their most genuinely themselves. He had the full archive of their lives inside him, and he was also their destroyer. This is a kind of grief that has no name in any language that the living world has produced, because no living consciousness has ever been asked to hold it. The White Walkers that served the Night King as lieutenants were, according to the law of the books, Craster's male children given to the Night King in a ritual that had been ongoing for decades. These were not wild creatures, not beings made from nothing. They had once been human infants, transformed by whatever alchemy the Night King applied to them in the cold of the far north. And there is something in this that is simultaneously monstrous, and, if you tilt your head slightly, almost parental. The Night King made them in the only way he knew how to make anything, by taking a living thing and transforming it into something colder, something more durable, something capable of existing in the kind of permanent winter that he himself embodied. He was building a community from the only materials available to him. The Night King could not have children in the ordinary sense. He could not grow old and gather grandchildren around a fire and pass on his wisdom, and his stories, and his careful, glacial understanding of the world's history. He existed outside the cycle of reproduction and death that defines all ordinary living things. What he could do, what the only creative act available to him amounted to, was transformation. He took things that lived and gave them the kind of existence that he himself had, a cold and durable and memory-saturated existence, from which the warmth of individual selfhood had been removed but which preserves something of the original form. The Whites, in this light, are not merely soldiers. They are, in the Night King's understanding, a population. They are the people of his world, the inhabitants of the silence he was building, the community of preserved forms that represented his answer to the living world's community of changing, growing, dying, replacing itself organisms. He was not killing Westeros. He was converting it. He was changing it from one kind of existence, the warm, messy, weirwood-cutting, treaty-breaking, intensely temporary kind, into another kind, the cold, orderly, perfectly preserved, indefinitely maintained kind. The specific horror of the whites, from a human perspective, is that they wear the faces of people who are remembered. Viserion, Daenerys' dragon, became something that had to be killed twice, once in the ordinary death of a creature struck by an ice spear above the frozen lake, and once in the form it took after the Night King raised it. Still Viserion, still recognisably the dragon she had named and tended, but moving in service of a different will and breathing a fire that had become cold blue flame. The cruelty of this to Daenerys was not abstract, it was personal, but from the Night King's perspective there was no cruelty in it. He had preserved the dragon, he had kept it. By the logic of his purpose, he had done Viserion a kind of service. The dragon was now safe from time, safe from the entropy that would have taken it eventually regardless, held in the cold amber of a form that would not decay, and would not age and would not require the endless anxious care that living creatures demand from those who love them. Bran Stark, when he finally accessed the Weirwood network in its full depth, found that it contained the Night King too, that the creature he was supposed to be helping defeat was already present in the thing that had made both of them what they were, was woven into the memory of the same root system that contained Ned Stark's prayers and Lyanna Stark's weeping, and the last hero's departure into the dark and the face carving of the very first children of the forest, who had pressed their hands against the bark and asked the trees to remember. The Night King was not outside the network, not separate from it, not the enemy of it. He was part of it, and Bran was part of it, and the confrontation between them was the network's attempt to resolve a contradiction that had been present in its own structure since the moment the dragonglass was pressed into a human heart. Arya Stark, who killed the Night King, was not connected to the Weirwood network in any meaningful way. She was not a greenseer. She did not carry the blood of any ancient tradition that would have given her cosmological significance in the Night King's calculations. She was simply a person who had trained for years with extraordinary focus and discipline, who had arrived at the moment of the confrontation via a route that was entirely outside the patterns the Night King could see in the network, because the network did not contain Arya. She was the blind spot. She was the thing outside the archive, and in the end, the most extensive memory system the world had ever produced was defeated not by a counter-memory, but by a person who had, quite deliberately, spent years learning how to be no one. The library is quiet now. The great accumulated memory of tens of thousands of years of watching and recording is still, somewhere, in the roots of the remaining Weirwoods, in the heart tree in Winterfell's Godswood, in the carved faces that stare out from pale bark across the continent. What does it mean to be a memory that cannot be forgotten? The Weirwood network does not process its contents the way human memory does. It does not rank by emotional significance, does not suppress the painful and elevate the pleasurable, does not distort with time. Every face is equally present. Every moment has the same weight as every other moment. The prayer of a frightened child before a heart tree in a blizzard is held with the same fidelity as the counsel of the last hero with the children of the forest. The small and the cosmic sit side by side in the archive, equally preserved, equally available, equally demanding of attention from any consciousness that opens to the network's full depth. Bran Stark, in his early sessions with the three-eyed raven, was overwhelmed by this. The show renders it as a sensation of being submerged, an oceanic, disorienting abundance of seeing that threatened to dissolve the individual consciousness attempting to navigate it. What Bran had to learn, and what took most of his training, was not how to see more but how to choose what to look at. The capacity was total from the beginning. The discipline was the work. He had to learn how to hold the archive without being held by it, how to maintain the thread of his own present moment identity while moving through a structure of memory that had no present moment at all, only the perpetual simultaneous availability of every past moment that had ever been recorded. The Night King had never learned this, or had never had the opportunity to learn it, because his transformation had not come with a teacher or a gradual acclimatization. The dragon glass had gone in, and the whole weight of the network had come flooding through simultaneously, without preparation, without the careful construction of an individual consciousness capable of holding the flood without drowning. Whatever the man had been before the transformation, whatever particular, specific, personally shaped interior life he had maintained, it had been overwhelmed in an instant by 10,000 years of accumulated memory, and what emerged from the flood was not a person inside a vast consciousness, but something closer to the consciousness itself, given a body and a direction, and a purpose that was less chosen than assigned by the weight of everything it now contained. The Night King is gone, but the things he preserved are not all gone. The memory persists, the root network persists. And somewhere in its vast, slow, arboreal consciousness, there is probably the memory of the moment of the Night King's making, the face of the man he once was, looking out through the bark of the tree he was bound to on the last morning of his human life. That face is in there, that memory is held, and the trees, being trees, have no intention of forgetting. You're so close to sleep now that the distinction between being asleep and being awake has become less important than it usually seems. Both states are yours tonight. Both are gentle. The story is still here, still moving at the pace of your breathing, still carrying the long weight of Westeros's oldest secret through the dark towards something that might be called an understanding, or might simply be called rest. Either is fine. Either is exactly what you need. The words will come, and you can let them come without effort, without attention, without anything except the passive openness that sleep and story share. Toward the end of his long existence, the Night King made choices that, if they were choices in any meaningful sense, reveal something profound about what he understood and what he was trying to accomplish. He crossed the wall. He brought his army south. He targeted specifically not the most powerful military forces in Westeros, but the symbolic and cosmological centres of the living world's power, Winterfell, with its ancient heart tree, and the living people who represented the continuity of the old ways. Jon Snow, the last and perhaps most genuine heir to the tradition of the last hero, and Bran, the new three-eyed raven. He was not interested in King's Landing. He was not interested in the Iron Throne, that ugly, uncomfortable monument to the peculiar Westerosi obsession with the symbolic trappings of power. He did not care about the politics of the Seven Kingdoms, about the question of which of the current claimants had the strongest claim to sit on Aegon the Conqueror's melted chairs. These concerns were entirely invisible to him, the way that the concerns of mayflies are invisible to mountains. He had been present, in the memory of his making, for the entire history of Westerosi politics. He had the full archive. He knew how it ended repeatedly every time, in fire and blood and the breaking of whatever had been built, and the slow beginning again from the ruins. What the Night King saw, from his vantage point of 8,000 years and the accumulated memory of 10,000 more before that, was a pattern, a cycle. Not the cycle of seasons, not the simple rotation of warmth and cold that the small folk used to orient their agricultural lives, but a deeper cycle. The cycle of civilization itself, the rising and falling of every structure that human ambition builds, the way that every kingdom eventually collapses into the rubble that becomes the foundation for the next kingdom, which will also eventually collapse. He had seen this happen through the network with the children of the forest themselves. He had seen it happen with the First Men. He had seen the Andal invasion and the displacement of the old ways and the rise of the Faith of the Seven. He had seen Valyria, that brilliant, terrible, magic-saturated civilization, consume itself in the doom. He had seen, in other words, that the living world did not learn. Not in the way that the Weirwood network learned, not with the cumulative, root-deep retention of every lesson that had ever been paid for. The living world forgot. It forgot because its practitioners died and its institutions were fragile and its memories were stored in material that burned, and its wisest voices were eventually replaced by the merely ambitious. It forgot the long night. It forgot the pact. It forgot what the wall was for. It would forget again, whatever came next. It was constitutionally, structurally, biologically incapable of remembering long enough to avoid repeating the patterns that the accumulated Weirwood memory could see, playing out with the slow inevitability of geology. It is worth sitting with this particular understanding, because it is the most charitable possible reading of the Night King's purpose, and charitable readings of the most terrifying figures in any story are often the ones that carry the most genuine insight. The Night King was not evil in the way that the story's framing largely invites us to accept. He was not motivated by cruelty, or by power, or by the kind of petty dominance that motivates the Joffreys and the Ramsays of the world. He was motivated by something more like despair. He was a being who had watched, from the specific, devastating perspective that the Weirwood network provided, the same catastrophe happen over and over in slightly different costumes, and he had reached, out of his despair, for the most absolute solution he could conceive. Stop the cycle entirely. This is, in its way, comprehensible. More than comprehensible, it is the comprehensible response of a being who has been denied the ordinary mercy of forgetting. Human beings forget because forgetting is protective. The machinery of human memory actively suppresses the most painful material, buries it in metaphor and dream, and the softening haze of time. This is not weakness. It is what allows the species to continue functioning in the aftermath of loss. The Night King had no such protection. His connection to the Weirwood network meant that every loss was permanently present, every catastrophe fully available for recall, every broken pact and burned forest and collapsed civilization immediately accessible to his consciousness at whatever resolution he cared to examine it. He could not forget Valyria. He could not forget the breaking of the original pact. He could not forget the long night itself, or what it had cost, or how it had ended. He carried it all perfectly forever. This is the shadow truth of the Night King that the story is almost, but not quite, willing to name. He was a monument to the cost of perfect memory. He was what happens when a consciousness is given access to the full weight of history, without the ordinary human capacity to absorb it, process it, and continue living. He had processed it the only way his transformed nature allowed, by concluding that if the living world's forgetting was the problem, then the removal of the living world was the solution. It is not a sane conclusion, by any ordinary measure, but it is a logical one, from inside the specific agony of knowing everything and being able to change nothing. The modern echo of this understanding runs, unexpectedly, through the character of Cersei Lannister, not because Cersei has anything to do with the Night King cosmologically, but because Cersei is the show's most articulate voice on the subject of the fundamental untrustworthiness of the living world's capacity for cooperation. Her central insight, that the alliances will break, that the promises will be forgotten, that when it comes to it everyone will prioritize their own survival over the collective good, is not wrong precisely. It is accurate as a description of how things tend to go. Where Cersei and the Night King diverge is that Cersei, being mortal and political, and deeply enmeshed in the world she is cynical about, still wants to participate in it, and to win within it. The Night King had moved beyond that. He had seen enough iterations of the Cersei position to know that even the cynics eventually get surprised. Even the people who think they understand the game get played by it. What nobody in Westeros could fully see, what the story itself only partially acknowledges, is that the Night King's apocalyptic solution was not entirely different in structure from the choices that the most admirable characters were making throughout the story. The willingness to sacrifice the many for a perceived greater good is not unique to the Night King. It runs through Stannis Baratheon burning his own daughter for a favourable wind. It runs through Daenerys burning King's Landing to break the cycle of tyranny. The difference is of scale, not of kind. The Night King had simply extended the logic of sacrifice to its absolute terminus, where the sacrifice was not any individual or any city, but the entirety of the warm, living, forgetting species that had made and unmade the world so many times already. There is a particular weight to the understanding that the most terrible things in history are made by the most frightened people. Not by the cruel, necessarily, not by the power-hungry, but by those who have been back to the edge of something unendurable, and have reached in their extremity for a solution that seems proportionate to their terror. Tyrion Lannister, who spent most of the series navigating between the various forms of human desperation, came closest of any living character to articulating the Night King's position. Not because Tyrion sympathized with him, but because Tyrion was the show's most honest voice about the gap between how people explain their actions and why they actually take them. His observation that people are more dangerous when they have nothing to lose than when they want something specific is the political version of the Night King's cosmic position. The Night King had nothing to lose because he had already lost everything, had it taken from him in an act of involuntary transformation 8,000 years before Tyrion was born. What remained was not loss, but the response to loss, which had long since become indistinguishable from purpose. The character who most purely mirrors the Night King's emotional logic, however, without sharing his cosmological scope, is Stannis Baratheon. Stannis, who believed with absolute cold, uncompromising certainty that he was right, that the law was the law, that the claim was the claim, that rightness did not require warmth or flexibility, or the capacity to see things from another perspective. Stannis burned everything that contradicted his certainty one by one with the same patient, inevitable progress that the Night King demonstrated in his southward march. Neither of them could be reasoned with, not because they were stupid, but because they had moved past the point where reason was the operative mode. Both were expressions of a single idea that had become so total it excluded all other ideas. The difference is that Stannis had chosen this, and the Night King had had it done to him. The Night King did not choose what he became. This is the detail that the story's framing as a conflict between good and evil consistently papers over, because a conflict between good and evil requires that evil be chosen, be embraced, be in some sense enjoyed, or at least willingly inhabited. The Night King inhabited his purpose the way a river inhabits its channel, not by choice, but by the simple fact of being the kind of thing that moves in the direction gravity points. His gravity was cold, his direction was south, his purpose was silence. He had not decided any of this. It had been decided for him, by terrified beings who were trying to save themselves, in a moment that the Weirwood network remembered perfectly, and that the rest of the world had almost entirely forgotten. There is a kind of terrible loneliness in that position, if you can allow yourself to feel it. To be the most knowledgeable being in the history of the world, to carry inside you the entire autobiography of a continent and its peoples, to have seen with perfect clarity the pattern of how it always goes, and to be so fundamentally, constitutionally alone in that knowledge that the only response available to you is silence, and cold, and the patient accumulation of the dead. The Night King was not evil. He was the most isolated person who had ever lived, or whatever version of living he had been given. He was the repository of everything and the companion of nothing. The roof breathes around you. The specific quality of the dark at this hour is its own kind of landscape, familiar and navigable, the known geography of a place you have visited every night of your life. You're not alone in it. The warmth of the bed, the particular sounds of the building settling, the faint sense of another person breathing somewhere close, or the soft sound of the street below. These things accompany, even in the silence. The Night King had none of them, and perhaps that is finally the most honest reason to feel something other than fear when the story brings you to his cold, patient, ice-blue gaze. He was alone in a way that no one should be. The story ends the only way it could, with the arrival of something he could not see coming, something warm and fast and entirely outside the archive of his terrible, perfect knowledge. Rest now. You are not alone. The warmth is real. You have been travelling for a long time now, through 12,000 years of a world's history, through the making and the breaking of the oldest pact in the mythology of Westeros, through the silence of the Night King and the patience of the Weirwood network and the terrible loneliness of a being who carried everything and could share it with no one. You have arrived, as all long journeys eventually do, at the place just before the end, that quiet, open country where the destination is visible ahead and there is no longer any need to hurry toward it, where the body has already begun to release the effort of the journey, and the mind has already begun to soften into the understanding that the arriving is done. The Night King's ending came quickly. That is one of the things about it that still generates conversation among those who love this story and have turned it over and over in the way that good stories deserve to be turned. 8,000 years of patient purpose, an army of the dead built over centuries, a crossing of the wall in a single spectacular act of destruction, a dragon turned to the cause of the cold, a march south that felt, in the way that inevitable things always feel, as though it had been building since before anyone present could remember. And then, at the moment of his apparent triumph, a girl arrived from the dark and pressed a blade into him, and he shattered into ice and silence. It was not an unsatisfying ending in the way that it is sometimes described. It was a mythologically coherent ending. The Night King was destroyed by what he could not see, by what was not in the archive, a young woman who had spent years learning how to exist outside the categories that the network recognized. The Weirwood memory, for all its depth, was a memory of what had already happened. Arya Stark was entirely present. She existed in the moment with a completeness that the Night King, for whom all moments were equally present and therefore somehow equivalent, could not match. She was not in the Weirwood. She was here, now, moving through the cold air of Winterfell's Godswood with the specific, narrow, entirely non-cosmic purpose of ending him, and that purpose, small and personal and utterly disconnected from the vast philosophical arguments of the last 12,000 years, was exactly what the vast philosophical arguments could not prepare against. But the ending of the Night King is not the ending of what he represented. This is the thought to carry with you as the story closes, the thought that the final movement of this night's lore is built around the force the Night King embodied did not die when he shattered. It went back to where it had always been. It returned to the cold, to the north, to whatever space beyond the remains of the wall still holds the conditions of permanent winter. The cycle did not end. The cycle merely completed another rotation. The children of the forest made the Night King because the living world was destroying the conditions necessary for the Weirwood network to persist. The living world's response to the Night King, eventually after everything, was to destroy the Night King and continue as before. The Weirwoods in the south had been largely cut down by the Andals before the Long Night returned, before the crisis brought the magical traditions back into urgent relevance. The Citadel, which had spent centuries systematically devaluing the knowledge that would have helped Westeros prepare for exactly this event, remained intact after the Night King's defeat. The Iron Throne was a matter of significant political concern during the very weeks when the Night King was marching south, consuming the attention and the resources of the people who should have been united against him. The lesson was not learned. This is the melancholy at the centre of the story of the Night King, the melancholy that the most careful reading of asoiaf keeps returning to. The lesson was not learned. The original sin, the cutting of the Weirwoods, the destruction of the conditions that the children of the forest required for survival, the relentless expansion of human civilization into every ecological and magical niche the continent offered. That sin was not addressed by the Long Night, and it was not addressed by the War for the Dawn, and it was not addressed by the building of the wall, and it was not addressed by the Night King's defeat. Bran Stark sat the Iron Throne and looked out from behind his ancient archive-heavy eyes, and the small folk of Westeros went about the business of being alive, which is to say the business of consuming and expanding and forgetting. It is worth sitting with the weight of that, very gently, here at the end of the night. The Weirwood network still exists. The carved faces still look out from the pale bark of the remaining heart trees, still watching, still recording. Whatever remnant of Greenseer consciousness persists in that network, including, perhaps, whatever of the Night King persist in the oldest and deepest roots, the ones that were not carved into weapons but simply grew, patiently, through the mineral dark of 10,000 years. It is still there, still watching the cycle, still noting, without judgment, the way the living world continues to be the living world, warm, noisy, inventive, destructive, capable of extraordinary beauty and extraordinary foolishness, and constitutionally committed to the proposition that this time will be different. Jon Snow, in the aftermath of the battle, was sent back north of the wall, exiled officially for the political necessity of satisfying the Unsullied after Daenerys' death. But there is another reading of that ending that the story offers alongside the political one, a reading in which Jon's return beyond the wall is not punishment, but restoration. He belonged there. He had always belonged there, in the specific way that a person belongs to a landscape that has claimed them at some level, below the biographical, below the accidents of birth and circumstance. He was the last heir to the tradition of the last hero, to the tradition of the person who goes north, because someone has to, because the cold is real, and it is better to face it clearly than to pretend that a wall is sufficient protection forever. And the wildlings went with him, the free folk, those people who had spent the entirety of recorded Westerosi history being categorized as the threat from without, as the barbarian horde that the Night's Watch existed to contain. They walked back north into the land that had always been their home, and Jon walked with them, and the great pine forest of the far north received them all with the particular, patient welcome of a landscape that has been waiting for the people who belong to it to come back. There were weirwood trees there. There were still carved faces looking out from pale bark, still watching, still connected to whatever remains of the network. Perhaps that is the best ending available to a world as old and as complicated as the world of ice and fire, Not resolution, but continuity. Not the final answer, but the ongoing question. Not the permanent victory of warmth over cold, or cold over warmth, but the continued conversation between them, conducted in the slow, root-deep language of the Weirwood network, in the creak of ice on winter rivers, in the breath of a man walking north through snow with a group of people who have stopped trying to be anything other than what they are. Sansa Stark, who became Queen in the North, understood something about the meaning of the Night King that she never articulated as theory, but demonstrated consistently through her choices. She refused to go south. She refused to subordinate the North's identity and independence to whatever reconstruction was happening in the kingdoms below the neck. She had been in the south. She had sat in the courts of King's Landing and watched the machinery of ambition and cruelty operate at full efficiency, and she had survived it. And her survival had taught her that the things worth preserving were the small, specific, unglamorous things. The independence of a people who had learned to live in the cold, the continuity of a tradition that remembered something the South had always been too warm and too comfortable to bother remembering. She was not, in any cosmic sense, a steward of the old agreement, but she was, in the most practical possible sense, a person who had decided that the North would keep its character, even at the cost of its formal sovereignty. The Weirwood in Winterfell's Godswood still stands. The water of the hot springs that has always kept that particular Godswood green through the northern winters still moves beneath the roots. The face carved into the pale bark still looks out with its red sap eyes over the courtyard where Ned Stark knelt every morning, and Robb Stark said his private prayers, and Arya Stark practiced her forms before the dawn, and Bran Stark learned, sitting in his wheeled chair in the quiet, to stop being Bran Stark entirely and become something much older and harder to name. All of those faces were seen. All of those moments were recorded. The archive holds them, and somewhere north of the wall, in the vast emptiness of the lands beyond the fist of the first men and beyond Hardhome and beyond the furthest range of any living crow, the cold persists. Not as the Night King persisted, not as a consciousness, not as a purpose, not as a slowly advancing army of the dead, simply as climate, as weather, as the ordinary enormous geological fact of a continent that extends far enough north to touch the genuine world-edge cold that needs no animation to be formidable. The cold was there before the Night King. It will be there after every king and every wall and every dynasty and every contested throne has passed out of the particular chapter of history that the story of Ice and Fire concerns itself with. The remaining Weirwoods carry what they have always carried. The face carved into the heart tree at Winterfell still looks out over the Godswood, still watches the hot spring that has never frozen, still holds within its ancient wood the accumulated memory of every Stark who ever knelt before it, in the grey northern morning, and pressed their hands against the bark and said whatever they needed to say to whatever they believed was listening. Ned Stark is in there. Robb Stark is in there. Every generation of that long, stubborn, winter-adapted lineage has added its thread to the tapestry that the tree maintains. And somewhere in that tapestry, if you looked with the right eyes, you would find the thread that Jon Snow added on the morning of his vows, the specific quality of his silence before the tree, the particular weight of a young man who did not fully understand what he was promising, but was determined to keep the promise regardless. That thread connects to every other thread that has ever been added to any Weirwood in the network, and through those connections to the entire history of the world, and at the deep centre of that history, patient and cold and present, the memory of what was done and what was made and what was lost and what was preserved sits waiting to be understood by whatever consciousness is willing to go deep enough to find it. Your breath is the only sound in the room that matters now. In and out, slow and reliable, the body doing what it has always known how to do, without instruction, without effort, without the need for any conscious direction at all. This is the oldest intelligence. The intelligence that was operating before language, before the Weirwood network, before the Children of the Forest or the First Men or the Night King or any of the long, layered, complicated history that has been unfolding through this night's telling. The intelligence of a living thing in the dark, breathing, resting, restoring itself for another day. It does not need to understand everything. It does not need to resolve anything. It only needs to keep breathing, which it is already doing, which it will continue to do quietly and faithfully, all the way through until morning. The Night King understood permanence but not rest. He held everything but could release nothing. And perhaps that is the final thing to carry from this night's journey. Not as lesson, not as warning, but simply as a quiet recognition. The ability to let go, to close the eyes, to allow the day's accumulation to settle into whatever tomorrow will make of it is not weakness. It is the thing that the Night King in all his terrible archive-heavy permanence could never do. Rest is the thing he was trying to end, and you, here, breathing slowly in the dark, are doing what he could not. You are releasing. You are letting the history be history, and the night be night, and the sleep be sleep. If you are still here, still breathing slowly in the dark, then you have already done the most important thing. You have stayed. You have allowed the noise of the waking world to recede far enough that something quieter and older can be heard. And in the quiet, perhaps, there is something that the Night King himself was always, in his cold and absolute way, trying to say. That the world is very old, and human civilization is very brief, and the things that we build and the agreements that we make and the names that we attach to the boundaries of our territories are real and meaningful and worth maintaining, and also provisional and temporary, and always being watched by something patient and vast and not entirely sympathetic, from just beyond the light of whatever fire we have managed to keep burning through the night. The stories will be here tomorrow, the history will keep, and now your watch is ended. If you like this video, let me know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is. I'm always curious about that. And if you have a suggested topic, feel free to leave it in the comments.